All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started today. We're going to continue in the world of Photoshop, and I'm going to introduce you to a concept that's called blending modes. And it has to do with how you're combining different layers together. And I think it's one of the things that's nestled in Photoshop that makes Photoshop so great, but it's also one of the things that you tend to gloss over. And a lot of you have experience in Photoshop. You've worked with Photoshop before. You have a general understanding of how Photoshop works. And I bet if I asked you, even though you thought you knew a lot about Photoshop, if you knew what blending modes were, you would say no, because it's not that commonly used. But at the same time, I think it's one of the more powerful things that's built in, which is why I devote a whole lecture to talking just about blending modes. So what are blending modes? I think the easiest way of explaining this is that you guys have all drawn on trace before, right? So you draw something on your first sheet of trace, and then you lay another sheet of trace over the top of it, and you draw again. So let's say, for this example, that you have a white piece of trace. You draw something. You lay another piece of white trace over the top. You draw something else. And you lay another piece of white trace over the top, and you draw something else. You're starting to layer those up, and that white trace is affecting the layer below. So it makes what you drew on the previous layer a little bit ghosted. Now, if you, instead of using white trace on your next layer, if you got out a piece of yellow trace and you put it down, it would change the look of the overall stack. True? Yeah. Blending modes are kind of the same thing. We're changing how the layer stack of the layer is affecting the rest of the stack. So instead of just making it a simple transparency or a combination of the two, we're mathematically changing how one layer is affecting the layer below it. And so we'll go through what these are, and I'll show you a bunch of examples. We'll do live examples together today, because I think that'll help make it make a little bit more sense. So the key here is that it's using different mathematical models to combine layers together. So the blending modes in Photoshop are divided into groups. Those groups are shown at the right. Unfortunately for us, the individual names don't really tell you a whole lot about what's going to happen, which is unfortunate, because we don't know what the difference between a color dodge is and a linear dodge, for example. And it doesn't really matter for what we're trying to do, because we're not going to use either one of those. But it's important to know that they are, in fact, different. So we have a couple ones that are really common. And those really common ones are going to be defined into these major groups. The darkening of an image is generally going to be multiply, but everything in this section from there to there is going to be the darkening of your image. The next group down is generally the lightening of an image, this section, and we're going to almost always use screen mode for that. And then finally we get into this section here, which is about doing both the lights and the darks at the same time without affecting the middle values. So we're going to darken the darks and lighten the lights. And the two that we'll use in this class will be overlay. We use that one a lot. And then the other one is soft light. We're going to use that a little bit later on in the semester, but I'll point it out now. So let's go through some illustrations of blending modes. And it's always hard to kind of do this in live lecture format, which is why I'm going to have you download a sample file today, and we're all going to work with that sample file together before you get into the exercise, because it makes a lot more sense when we do it together and see what happens. So for this scenario, and this is also what you'll play around with as a sample file, there are two layers in Photoshop. The one on the bottom is all blue, and the one on the top has, this is the layer on the top, has three colored squares: a dark gray square, or almost a black square, a medium gray square, and a white square. And then at the bottom it has a gradient going from black to white. So that is applied on top of the blue layer. And so when they're combined together, what you would see on the screen is this. In this scenario, the top layer is 100% opaque. It's just a regular layer. So whatever's on that layer is on top. It's just like putting a piece of trace down and you stick something on top, and it's now on top of that layer stack. So we're going to then apply some different blending modes to that top layer, the one with the three colored squares and the gradient. And hopefully this will help to illustrate it. We're going to start with that multiply blending mode. And the multiply is about darkening the image. So here, what we're going to see happen is the areas that are lighter, the ones in the red square here, are going to become transparent or semi-transparent. And the areas that are dark or darker are going to make the background become even darker. So when I apply this blending mode like this, the white becomes transparent. It goes away. The medium gray darkens the blue a little bit. And the black, in this case, really darkens the blue. So we get a really dark blue. And you can see that happen on the gradient going across. So let me back up really quick, and we'll flip through these one more time so you guys can see it. Maybe not. There we go. All right. So there we are with our solids. We apply a multiply blending mode, and the white becomes transparent. That's kind of the key thing here. Screen mode, on the other hand, is going to be almost the exact opposite. So the white areas are going to be lighter. The medium grays are going to lighten the blue a bit, and the black areas are going to become transparent. So it's the opposite of what we did last time. So when we go forward there, there's what's happening. I made a mistake in the sample file. The black isn't a true black. It's a really dark gray. So that's why we see a little bit of ghosting there. Overlay is going to darken the darks, lighten the lights, but the middle is going to become transparent. So that 50% gray square in the middle is going to ultimately become the transparent piece. So as we see this apply, there we go. The black darkened the blue, the white lightened the blue, and the middle became transparent. So you guys are like, great. You've walked me through this. Why on earth does this matter? Well, it does matter, and I'm going to show you how in just a second. I'm going to switch over to the school computer. The lecture portion today, the slides are really short because we're going to spend a lot more time in demo mode. So I'm going to switch over to the school computer. While I do that, I want you to navigate to the course website and today's exercise. In the very beginning of that, I have a Photoshop file that I want you to download. It'll say blending modes, ps-blendingmodes.psd. So in the first little step in part 1, I want you to download that so that we're ready. And go ahead and log into Photoshop and open it up while I switch over, and then we'll continue on from there. OK? OK, so we're going to continue on here. So this was the piece that I wanted. The download the sample file ps-blendingmodes.psd. That will open in Photoshop, and it will look shockingly the same as the samples that I just showed you. And on your screen, you should be able to tell that this is really a dark gray instead of a black. That was my mistake when I built the file in the first place. So we have this, and if I look over at the layers window here, actually, you know what? I'm going to switch into my photography workspace. So once again, that's over by where you close the program. It's this icon here. I'm going to go ahead and click on it and switch from Essentials down into Photography. OK, so now that's done, I'm going to look here at the Layers palette right there. And we have 2 layers that we're looking at. This is exactly what I described. The background layer right here is just a blue. Above that, I have a layer that is just these 3 squares and this gradient. And you can tell that the rest of this is transparent. So these pieces are all transparent because of that checkerboard pattern. So as I'm showing you this, I'm toggling on and toggling off different layers. You'll also notice that there are 2 more layers. There's a layer 2 and there's a layer 3. We'll talk about those in a little bit. So leave those off for right now. We're going to work with just the basic layers themselves to get started. So remember that a blending mode is always applied to a layer, and it's usually applied to the layer that's on top of other layers. So in this scenario, I'm applying the blending mode to layer 1, and it's going to change what happens with the background layer, or layer 0. So to change the blending mode, it's pretty easy. I just have to select the layer itself. So in this case, layer 1 is selected. And then I come up at the top of the layer palette here, and I'm going to change where it says normal. Those are my blending modes. There they all are. And the cool thing about the new versions of Photoshop is they actually do a live preview. So you can just hover over and see what's happening. And we're going to first go to the multiply blending mode. Remember, this group here generally darkens the image. And you can actually scroll through and see the darkening happen on these various options. The multiply one is what we would pick. And there we can see that the white has become completely transparent. The middle here, the medium gray of 50%, has become a darker blue. And the darkest gray has become almost black. so a very, very dark blue. So it's affecting the blue color underneath. Now if I were to switch from multiply mode down to the next set into screen mode, the opposite's happening. So this is exactly what I was showing you live in lecture, and that is that the white is nice and solid. The medium gray has lightened the blue to a kind of a light blue, and the dark gray, because it's dark gray and not black, has made the blue a little bit lighter as well. So you can see that happening there. The last option down here is overlay. And overlay is doing both. So the lights are becoming lighter, so the blue becomes lighter. The darks are becoming darker, so this the dark square makes the blue even darker, and the middle becomes transparent. So there's a point at which it's exactly perfect and it matches the background color. It looks like my gray was slightly off for the middle, but you get the idea. So those are the three big blending modes that we're going to be working with over the course of the semester. So now you're saying, well, why does this really matter? So let's turn on layer 2. I'm going to turn off layer 1 and I'm going to turn on layer 2. So this is pretty common. Whether you're in the architecture world or whether you're in industrial design, you work in a program. Maybe it's SketchUp, maybe it's Fusion 360, maybe it's whatever. And typically you work on some kind of a white background. Well, when you work on that and you take a screenshot, or you work on that and you do a rendering, you're going to end up with this white background. And if you want the background to be transparent because you want to be able to apply it onto a big poster, or you want the background to essentially go away, most of the time as a young student, you would go through and you'd actually say, okay, well, I need to delete the background, so let me use the magic wand and I'll try to delete the background, and it's a whole lot of work. We just learned about blending modes. We learned that if we apply a multiply blending mode to this image, the white becomes transparent and the darks or the blacks become darker. So if I take this image and I switch, let me go to layer 2 here, and I switch my blending mode into multiply, I've just gotten rid of all that white. So the white is now transparent. The blacks are still there, but the white is transparent. So I saved myself a bunch of work isolating that object. Made it a lot easier on me. Now, if I switch down into the screen mode, you see that something different happens. So in this scenario, all of my lines turn blue because the black areas became transparent. The white is solid, so the color behind is shining through. So it's a different strategy. And then finally we get to the overlay mode, which in this scenario really does nothing. So it doesn't help us too much. So most often we're going to be using multiply in this scenario. Sometimes you want to invert the colors and you end up with screen mode. The next one here, for illustration purposes, is the same image, but it's inverted. It's white lines on a black background instead. So in this scenario, instead of going to the sorry, wrong thing here. Instead of going to the multiply blending mode, which doesn't help us much, we're going to go to the opposite, which would be screen mode. Or excuse me, screen mode, which is going to make the black become transparent and let the white stand out. So do you see the application of this going forward? How it's a useful thing to have in your toolbox? That's good. There are direct implications for photography, which I'm going to move into going forward. So we can actually use the same techniques to enhance photographs as well. So I'm going to work you through that whole scenario starting next. So we're going to move down into part 2. You didn't have to save anything for this part 1. This was merely an illustration, so we could work through it together. You guys could see what I was talking about, where to make the changes, and that sort of thing. In part 2, I'm going to ask you to start by finding a old faded black and white photograph. You may have one of your own to work with. You may not. If you don't, no big deal. We're going to search for one. When we're working on images, the temptation is always you jump to Google image search and you say, OK, I want a faded photograph. Now the problem when you do this is that many of these images have copyrights on them, or somebody owns them. And they theoretically could get cranky with you for using it because they own it. And they could come back and they could sue you or whatever. In all likelihood, you're doing this in class. nobody's going to come after you. I think in my 12 years of teaching, I've had one request to take down an image because it was copywritten. So it's not that common, but it is courteous to, instead of just picking an image from Google, to either search using the Creative Commons search engine, which allows you to use, basically the Creative Commons is a licensing system that allows people to say, hey, you can borrow my work, you can adapt it, and I'm cool with that. And they're not going to come after you later on. So if you go to search.creativecommons.org, it'll take you to this Creative Commons search engine. It's asking for search for images. We're going to say old, faded photograph. And I'm going to check the box here for modify or adapt. I don't care if I'm not using it for commercial purposes, so that doesn't matter. I'm going to choose modify or adapt, and then I'll go ahead and search. And it brings up a variety of images for me. As I scroll down, I'll be able to load more and more images going forward. The other thing is if you're in the Google realm and you've done a Google image search, that's fine. Just be aware that under Tools here, you can choose usage rights. And you could say, I want it labeled for non-commercial reuse with modification. That would be you. You're not using it for commercial purposes. You're not selling it. But you are going to modify it. You're going to work on it. And so if you search with that, you'll find a bunch of examples there as well. So in terms of what you actually pick to work with, it's really up to you. It's your choice. I have a variety of options that I've already saved. I'll go ahead and download a few. With Google Images, you want to actually go to the site itself. If you can, there it is. And then when you download it, in this case it's Flickr, you want the largest size possible. So I'll download the original size here. And this one might be good. I'm downloading a couple of them because I want to be able to show you these as we go through them. So we'll go to large size there. OK, so there's a couple of examples there. Go ahead and show them. They're there on my downloads folder. I'm going to go ahead and open them up in the world of Photoshop. So we'll jump over into Photoshop. I'm going to go to File and then Open. I'm not going to drag them in. If you drag them in, it'll embed them. It'll place them into the active file. Instead, I'm going to go to File and then Open. These were downloaded into my Downloads folder. There they are. And I will open both of them. And there we are. This one might not be recoverable. There might not be enough detail to really do too much with it, but we'll try. This one we should be able to enhance rather nicely. OK, so I've found a couple images to work with. I'm next going to create an adjustment layer for levels, which we did. This is Photoshop 1.2. We've done this before. I'm going to go ahead and go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Levels. And we can leave it called Levels. And in this scenario, there's not a whole lot that I can do. I've got even distribution all the way from white to black. I could, I guess, darken it just a little bit, but there's not too much for me to do. So that's fine. We have our levels, and we have our background image. I'm going to change this levels in how it applies to the image itself. So instead of just being a levels adjustment here, I'm going to go ahead and go to my blending modes, and I'm going to first switch to multiply. And you'll see that it made a pretty dramatic difference in darkening the darks of this image. So I'm working just with the darks in this scenario. Now, if I created, I'm going to go ahead and do these separately. Actually, let me, for clarity purposes, I'll go ahead and name these. So that one's called multiply. I'm going to create a new layer. I'll turn that one off. I'll create the same thing. I'm going to go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and we will do a Levels adjustment again. And this one I'm going to call Screen, and I'll say OK. So here we are with our screen adjustment. Nothing's happened yet, but I'm going to change the blending mode from normal down to screen. So in that case, it really didn't help me too much. It made the image too light. So that probably isn't the best strategy. But I'm going to have you go through this with all your images. The next one, same thing. Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Levels. And we'll go ahead and say this one is going to be Overlay. And I'll go ahead and say OK. There's the overlay mode. And I'm going to switch my blending mode down to overlay. So in this scenario, it darkened the darks and lightened the lights. So the most effective one of these three options for the old photograph was this first one, the multiply blending mode. Sometimes one of these blending modes is a little bit too strong. It does too much. In that scenario, you can actually adjust over here to the opacity. You could turn down how much that blending mode is applying. So I'm going to leave it all the way up so you guys can see it there. So let me do that again. I'll come to this image here. So same thing. I'm going to go up to my layer, new adjustment layer, levels. And so this first one is going to be multiply. There it is. This one I can gain a little bit just through the levels adjustment. Just by itself, that can help. But I'm going to take it a step further and switch this into multiply mode. And there we go. And we can see that that was a pretty extreme shift from where it was to where it is now. And this might be a scenario where it's a little bit too strong, in which case I could go back to this opacity slider and I could drop down how strong that is applying there. So I can do the same thing. I'll go to layer, new adjustment layer, and this one we will do a levels. And this will be screen. I'll pinch those in just a little bit, and my blending mode would then be screen mode. And so in this scenario, again, it didn't help too much, but I'm going through the process and practicing with this anyway. One more time, layer, new adjustment layer, and we'll go to levels. This is going to be the overlay. Same thing where I'll make those levels adjustments, and then I'll switch this into overlay mode like that. So again, I think the multiply mode ended up being the best, although the overlay, sorry, there you go, did help bring out his face just a little bit. But again, it's always dependent on the image that you pick. Sometimes you might end up picking an image that's darker to begin with, where there's pieces of the image that are dark. See if I can find one. Where it's too dark. Yeah, I'm not finding a good option right now. Maybe that one. And you can end up enhancing that as well by lightening it. But I'm not finding a good example for you, so I'm not going to spend too much time looking for it. OK, so I've gone through, and I've done multiply, screen, and overlay. You're going to do that. If you want to, you can use the same image for all three. This would be part 2, part 3, and part 4. You could also pick 3 different images. It's up to you for part 2, 3, and 4. Part 5, we're going to, instead of using an old faded photograph, we're going to use something with a lot of color in it, a lot of blues and a lot of reds. I have some sunset examples that I've already downloaded to my flash drive. I'm going to go to File and then Open, and I'm going to go to my flash drive here. You can pick one of your own images, or you can pick another one. I'm going to open up a couple different options here. Let's take this and this. All right, 2 different options. I'll start with this one here, sunset picture. This happens to be a high dynamic range picture anyway, so I've got a little bit of extra help there. And we're going to do something a little bit different. So this next one under part 5, we're going to apply a luminosity blending mode to our layer. So I'm going to start by creating a curves adjustment. I'm going to go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to choose Curves. And I'm going to call this Luminosity. And I'll go ahead and say OK. I'm going to create our standard S curve. So I'll peg the center of my curve there, and I'll pull up this just slightly, and I'll pull down this one just slightly. So again, traditional S curve looks like an elongated S. And with that, I'm going to take my blending mode and not use it in normal mode. I'm going to switch all the way down here to luminosity. It's the last one. And it might be hard for you guys to see it on the screen, but it pulls out a fair amount of the color in a really nice way. So if you want to deepen the saturation of the blues and the reds, this is a good option. Let me do it with another image just for practice here. I'm going to go ahead and go to File and then Open. I'll pick an image from last class. Let me try this one. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go up to my layer, new adjustment layer, curves. I'll peg the center. I'll pull up the curve here just a little bit. I'll pull down the curve there just a little bit. So I have my traditional S curve. Then I'll take this curves adjustment layer and I'll come all the way down to luminosity. And so you can see that it really helps to bring out those reds and the colors. There's a big difference, though, than just the simple curves adjustment layer. Let me turn that off again so you can see the contrast of all three. Let me go to layer, new adjustment layer. We'll go to curves again. And we'll peg the center. We'll pull up and we'll pull down there a little bit. So in this scenario, if you look at I don't even know what these are, some kind of cookie pastry things. There's a lot of yellow saturation here that got boosted in that curves right in here. And when we apply the luminosity to it, that yellow saturation goes away because we're not focusing on the yellow. We're focusing on deepening the reds or the blues of the image. So depending on the colors in your image, you can get really good results out of something like this. Again, using a blending mode. So there's another strategy there. That's in part 5 that you're going to play around with. OK, the next thing here is we're going to go into part 6. And so sometimes when we're working on an image, we want to change the background so that it's not quite so sharp. We want to add a little bit of dirt to it or a little bit of extra texture to it. And that's something that we can work with. And I'll do this on several different images so that you can see as I go through it. So let's start with this image here. In this scenario, I'm going to bring in what's called a grunge texture. And essentially, it's an image of dirt. If you do a Creative Commons image search or a Google modified non-commercial reuse with modification for grunge texture, you'll see examples of what I'm talking about. So they're pictures of walls. They're pictures of things with scratches, these kinds of pieces. This is a pretty nice one. This one might require a login to download. Sometimes these images. Go ahead and download that one. Yeah, please log in. So I'm not going to download that one. I have a bunch of these already on my flash drive, so I really don't need to download a fresh one. But you get the idea. Okay, any one of these would be nice ones. And they can really enhance what this is looking like. So once you download that, we're going to go ahead and place that file into this image. So I'm going to go up to the File menu, and I'm going to choose Place Embedded instead of File Open. So I'm going to go to File, Place Embedded, and I'm going to find that grunge texture. I store those inside my Resources folder, inside a folder called Grunge Textures. There we go. And you can see that I have a whole bunch of these grunge textures that I end up using. And so I can choose any one of these, some of which are colored. I'm going to use this crumpled paper one because it's pretty obvious when I apply the texture. I'm going to go ahead and choose a place. And there you go. It comes in. This one happens to be pretty small, so I need to make it a little bit larger. I am, by the way, holding down the Shift key on the keyboard to maintain the proportions of this image. It doesn't really matter that this maintains proportions because it's just crinkled paper. So I could make it bigger, but holding down Shift key will help keep it into proportion. There we go. And so we'll make this guy a little bit bigger. And I'm just going to stretch it a little bit to fit my image. So I have this crumpled paper texture. I'm going to go ahead and commit to the size change with this little check mark up here. There's the texture. Now I want that texture to affect the image below. So I am once again going to go through my blending modes and see what happens. So I'll start with normal. Now if I went to multiply texture, we can see that yes, we're seeing the sunset through the crumpled paper. If I went to screen mode, we're seeing more of the paper and less of the sunset. And if I went to overlay mode, we're getting kind of a combination of both. And so you have to decide which one feels right. So in this, it depends on what you really want to see more of. If it's something like this where it's the screen, you may find that you switch to screen texture, but then you adjust the opacity of the screen texture way down so you have just a little bit of that pattern shining through. So let me do another example here. I'll go to File, and then I'll Place, Embedded. And instead of picking something like that, I'll pick something with just a little bit of dirt around the edges. Maybe this one. Here we go. Make that one a little bit bigger. That one a little bit bigger, something like that. Same thing, I'll switch into my screen mode, and I'll adjust that opacity down. Oh, looks like it's already adjusted down. There it is. To have just a little bit of it showing through. If that's not working quite the way I want it to, I might switch to multiply mode to see more of my image and less of the texture, but it just adds a little bit of character to the image. So it may or may not be something that you like the results of, but I want to point out that this is a way of combining images, and it gets you practice going through this. Let me do it with this one over here. Same strategy here. I'll go to File and then Place, Embedded. And we'll pick a different texture. Let's see here. There you go. Same thing. I'll switch my blending mode. I'll try multiply and see what happens. Yep, there's a little bit of that texture. You can actually really see this combined together. Maybe that's a little bit too much, so we'll adjust that opacity so we have just a little bit of that texture in the background. Okay, so I'm going to have you guys go through that in part 6. When we get to part 7, it's about posting your work. I want the original image for however many original images you used. I want the modified version. So if you're going through the screen, the multiply, and the overlay modes, part 2, part 3, and part 4, there should be a modified version of each there. So if we had one old photograph, we'd have the original plus 3 modifications. That would be 4 images. Next one would be luminosity. That would be an original and a modified luminosity. So that would be 4, 5, 6 images. When we move on into the grunge background texture, depends on whether you do a fresh image or whether you continue with your luminosity image as you go through. But you're going to have basically 7 or 8, maybe up to 10 different images that you're going to post. Okay? So I'm going to turn you guys loose. Please take some time to really understand. If you want to experiment a bit and use other modes, don't be afraid to go through those other modes as well, because you can get interesting and good results out of those other modes. The nice thing is that you can scroll through these now and kind of see how it changes and how they apply. And you may end up finding that some of those options are pretty good, or that you like them. Okay? So I'm going to have you guys work through that. If you're done with those, start working on your assignment. Okay? That's due a week from today, Wednesday the 18th. You had a question in the back. Okay, I'll come help you with that. Are there any other questions for the whole group? No? Okay, I'll let you guys start to work.